So this is going to be a heavily just contextual, the ideas that I have right now. This is about politics and planning and I guess strategy and a way that I feel like I can contribute. So let me just address it up front. I think it's almost like necessary that the left provides a clear roadmap, the direction that they want to go and what they stand for, and the action items and the plan to approach those action items that they have. That's, quick tangent on that is it's important to have that as a response to kind of ultimately what Project 2025 was all about. There's going to be so many things that have to be kind of walked back because of that. How do we handle that? But it's also important because the shortcoming of Democrats today has been their inability to do fucking anything. The shutdown is a great example of kind of exactly what we're talking about. So, and among so many other things, but people really need to see that the Democrats have a plan, a game plan. It's laid out, it's well thought out, and it's a progression. All right, this is here's everything that you're going to see on our campaign and why. Here are the ways that we're going to approach it, right? And I think it's important to do that as a part of the campaign process to allow the conversation between the parties to happen so that Democrats can get ahead of addressing any concerns. Because, and this is kind of the third part, ultimately it needs to be a unifying plan. There needs priority one, let's say, is about reuniting as a country. So this is not, let's be very, very clear and baked into all of this, I would want to make it very explicitly clear that this isn't the left, leaning version of Project 2025. It's not the same type of thing just with the left lean, but rather it's a bipartisan plan, right? A roadmap for kind of rebuilding and establishing some new foundations, which I think ultimately includes outlining for Republicans what we see as necessary for a rational opposition or whatever, the legitimate opposition, something opposition. Anyway, so that's why I think it's important to bring that up front. Because, again, and all of that feeds into like the campaign thing and it helps kind of build that conversation up front. And because I think, in order to build that unity aspect, there needs to be some bipartisan communication going on. Start mending fences and all of that during the campaign process. Specifics here. Through the campaign, this is what we want to do. Through the next 2 years, right? I think they need to roll this out as a part of the 2026 midterms, as it gives them the opportunity to provide these campaign promises, and then over the next 2 years, work on those things and execute and show the progression of the party and the commitment to upholding these plans, which and then in turn can lead to a presidency that is mapped out, well thought out, and we get shit done. So a couple of things about this plan. As I mentioned, this unifying piece of it is going to be certainly is going to be critical. But I want to do, and I'm just going to say this so I can have it down. It needs to be something from an argument perspective, so sound. And so I think it's about aligning on a framework. I think because ultimately, right, what has been threatened here is I think step one, we got to reestablish how we do government. So it's going to be, as a party, this is how we're seeing it. And it needs to not be too restricting. It needs to be open enough, right? Because that's the thing too. The idea here is like Aristotle's politics. It's influenced by that, but it's not the same. So I need to rework this. But the form and functions, right? The parts that make up the whole. There needs to be, it's not going to be true in all cases, right? Because different things operate slightly differently, but there are unifying threads from local government to state government to the federal government. There are certain overarching links that need to be established, right? So it's like, as a party, what's our primary, secondary, and tertiary responsibilities? And so I personally think it's empowering the household, a redistribution of power. And so I think it needs to be a bottom-up framework. So it's going to be about empowering the household, which is not right? Because the trap that people fall into is fixating on specific policy decisions that aren't really linked to any kind of bigger picture, right? They feel like the right thing to do. But it's it's necessary to provide like the rationale here. Okay, so since I've got that kind of out of the way, the tangent that I need to go on here is about that trap that people fall into, the leaning into specific policies, right? Because we don't need, like, there's a few contextual items that are influencing my thoughts right now. So to outline those, it's this video that I just watched, random guy, kind of irrelevant, but it opened up some thought starters for me about real estate. Parallel pathing that is this broader economic context that I've been exploring and everything going on with that. It's also climate stuff. It's also this foreign affairs issue. And it's also, I just went to a live taping of the Pivot podcast with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, who had JB Pritzker on. So I guess I am just going to do this. All of those other factors, I'll circle back to those, but I guess we'll kind of go in that order. So that this video that is, this isn't like the expert guy in the field. The expertise that I'll lean on is more in that second topic. This first one is just kind of it's an extension of that like bro finance YouTube culture. But he's like, it's one of those things, and it's so apparent for sure in the real estate conversations, but stock market and economic topics broadly as well. It's really easy for people to sound smart in these fields, and I'm not claiming to be smarter than any of these people. But the point that I'm making is these people are trying to sell the non-experts on their arguments in a way, right? I think ultimately when they're talking about these things, they're thinking about it in terms of having conversations with other experts. But the idea that wins out is going to be the idea that's beneficial to people, right? The non-experts, because they're not involved in the decision making. And so their expectation is that the people who are making those decisions are at the bare minimum not negatively impacting their life. But whatever. That's a whole different thing. So this guy is talking about the real estate market, and his argument or the topic or thesis of this video isn't actually even that clear. He teed it up as he just picked a buzzy current event and then talked about something completely different and then sort of tied it into this, but it was the 50-year mortgage thing that Trump has proposed, which I hate. I absolutely hate, cannot stand it. But because of my position, I want to see what the conversation around this is. And this goes into how I got to start thinking about planning, because I just think that there's such a need for it. Let's address it, and then I'll circle back to how they focus on the wrong thing. So he's talking about it, and he's like, well, and he says all of the same things that all of these guys keep saying, which is like, just buy real estate. Basically is the underlying argument. Like, it's always a good idea to buy real estate, and that, and the historical context that they bring to their arguments is really short-sighted and really limited to recent history. It's another reason why, like, I don't think it's such a major part of our lives. I don't think that we can be directing it based on very specific metrics. It's so complex. It's so macro that too many things are influencing it. We need to have more of a skeleton framework with levers to pull rather than policies that target specific issues. One of the things that he did that annoyed me, maybe this is just going to be maybe the reason why I want to talk about it is because I just want to rant against it, and I don't know how helpful it's going to be, but he was talking about some of the trends, and he was hitting some of the talking points that I am frequently seeing. So it's like, okay, there's overlap in the stuff that we're seeing, but there's a difference in the interpretation of what those people are seeing about that data. And so things like, he brought up the average age of first-time home owners is at the highest level in, I think he said 50 years. But again, that's a really limited historical context. And I think that metric I don't know, I haven't confirmed this yet, but I think instinctively that's a type of metric that the study of it wasn't introduced until about 50 years ago. It's a similar idea to like Amazon's antitrust paradox. The shift to price theory from economic structuralism is a great example of exactly kind of what I'm talking about. So there's this whole broader context of the overarching subject about antitrust law, which extends back to the early 1900s, particularly, kind of Great Depression era conversations. But then we have a definitive change in direction in the approach to our perspective when looking at antitrust law, that price theory versus economic structuralism. That happens in the 80s, right? And so the trap that people fall into very commonly today is that they're taking for granted that price theory is the option. And so they're neglecting I think in a lot of cases, assuming that the historical context that precedes it was inferior to this new version, which is why we made this shift. But that's not the case, and that's a dangerous way to view pretty much anything. Rather, I think the healthier and much more sound way to do it is to consider it as, in the 80s, we took a different perspective based on a theory that we were then going to act on because the theory was compelling to the people at that time. And now we have significant chunks of data about two markedly different perspectives about this topic that we can weigh against each other and discuss outcomes that have happened as a result of different perspectives. And so anyway, back to this guy, he's viewing, he's looking at the average age, the reason why that's getting so high. The metrics that he provided as his basis for the rest of his argument were things like that average household income going up, or the ability to purchase foreclosed houses, and additional metrics that I can't think of off the top of my head. But like, the takeaway that I had was all of the fundamentals there. His perspective is this skewed, financialized version of the real estate market, and is completely neglecting some critical elements for assessment here. So he talked about the home prices and mortgages, and got into mortgage rates and what is that? Cindy, no longer needing to report credit history in loans for mortgages. That's a new development in 2025. So again, one fundamental thing, and he said explicitly as it relates to the rates, because ultimately what these people are talking about a lot of times when they're talking about future predictions for real estate, right? Because they're looking at it through a financialized lens, and market trends. When you're looking at it through that, like, interest rates become a huge part of that conversation, because I think they overemphasize, like, it's weird. They weirdly prioritize that without putting it in context. That's a huge thing too. I'm happy that it came out that way. Just a side note, start examining how many things can be attributed to an argument that neglects placing a critical piece of that argument within the historical context. Ultimately, what I want to say here is he's neglecting the historical context around home prices and the completely irrational levels that we're at, right? So it's back to this assumption, like we've existed in such highly inflated home prices for so long that this extension into extremely overpriced real estate markets just seems like right, like we got used to high levels in such a way that it became our new base level, and now we're looking at this extension as just like a period of high costs, which is not accurate, certainly not in a historical context, and there's data points to support that. Like one of the most important things, and such like a common sense policy thing here to look at, is like the time it took to pay off. Oh, this is huge. All right. The time it would take to pay off a house in the 1950s and tracking that over time, right? In the early days of that reporting, or the metrics that we have to report on that, it was like 2 years. 2 years to pay off your house. And then you owned it, right? And over time, that's gotten to be wider and wider margins of time to be able to pay off your house. And I think that that's a much better indicator of the health of the real estate market. Is like, it should be about home ownership, which creates capital. If this is the economic system that we're going to exist in, you need to be, and there's a reason why the original natural rights set forth by the founding fathers were the right to life, liberty, and property. Because free people need to be able, and specifically in a capitalist economy, right? If that's the social structure that we're going to use, home ownership needs to be accessible. It needs to create value. The excess capital needs to come from somewhere else, because home ownership needs to not be, and ability to have shelter needs to be more democratized. And that's a message. So a message to Republicans, right? Again, to tie this back to one of the things that I'm talking about in this bigger framework, message to Republicans, like, you're losing a significant and an ever increasing amount of people who buy into the promises of capitalism, exemplified by the election of, I think it's not embodying necessarily the spirit totally, but Mamdani winning in New York, sort of like the mecca for capitalism, is now the mayor is a democratic socialist, because capitalism has time and time again shown that it's not operating in the best interest of the people, and real estate, I think, is one of those things. So anyway, this guy neglects the historical context. He doesn't understand home prices are extremely high right now. They're not just temporarily high from a baseline. The baseline that we've been operating in for years, like 14 years, and probably arguably even longer, since the 90s, maybe 2000. It's too high. A 50-year mortgage is going in the opposite direction. It's the wrong move. We need to be shortening the time to, it's not about, okay, and this is another distinction. It's not about the possibility of home ownership, right? Like, are you really a homeowner if you're locked into a 50-year mortgage, which this guy is, he's examining this, right? And he's saying, look, that's a long repayment term, and that's risky for lenders. And so to satisfy that risk, they're going to have high interest rates on those loans, which again, this goes back to, who gets hurt the most by all of these decisions and bad thinking like this guy, although he doesn't have the worst version of it. The people who need the support are considered the most risky here. And then the terms of the arrangements that we create actually make it harder for them in the long run. So higher interest rates make it less likely for someone to be able to pay the thing, not more likely, right? Because it's adding costs, and cost is a struggle for them. So these 50-year mortgages are going to have high interest rates. Like, so are you really free? Do you really own this thing? No. Short answer is no. You are enslaved to the debt that you have to pay for that thing. And there's a whole lot of consequences there. So I think that there was maybe, a couple different things that I wanted to capture that I didn't in that, but I got to move on. So I'll just recap and sort of try walk us back to what we're supposed to be talking about. The reason why I highlight all of that, right, is again because he's focusing on like specific policy things. He's also focusing on the real estate market within his real estate investment perspective in isolation and with really minimal consideration for the human element, which is something that I'm starting to explore more and more in these conversations, is like how often we leave out, like we focus on numbers and we think that the numbers represent the human element and therefore can be substituted for that consideration. But again, like just all of our markets they're acting irrationally. So that the human element, we are acting irrationally. And so the numbers cannot be, so the numbers are reflecting an irrational behavior to begin with. So what would I do and how do I use this to as a allegory for sort of this framework that I want to provide? Real estate, home ownership, the middle class are all going to be tied to this thing. And so if I'm suggesting we do this form, function, household, city, state, nation, bottom up framework, I would say, policy needs to empower the homeowner. It needs to establish, these are the bullet point things that Democrats could campaign on. Our goal is to empower the homeowner. How are we going to do that is X, Y, and Z. One way that we're going to do that is by, and let me just caveat really quickly, I think in the conversations here, we need one side looking at how can we strip things to achieve the same intended goal, but also how can we implement things that will do it. So my instinct here, right, as I was just talking about, is to say, how are we going to achieve a priority on households? By empowering the individual to own their household, right? If we want people to be operating, if we want to create unity in the country, we need to start creating unity in the households. One way that we'll do that is by establishing a precedent that individuals take priority over corporations, over institutional investors, and over even like the small market investors. The guys like the guy in the video who, or like my friends that are getting rental properties, right? We shouldn't be like, we need to shift the conversation from looking at real estate as investment, a financialized investment, and into a mentality around, oh, fuck yeah, all right. This is actually why I picked up the phone, or I'd been thinking about this. Okay, so there's going to be, my prediction here is going to be that there's going to be a shift back to utility. And so one of the things that, as I was exploring this, I need to learn more about John Maynard Keynes, who is sort of the foundation of our modern economic theory. And I don't have a strong grasp of what his position was. But I suspect that at some point, and I remember this vaguely from introductory economics classes, that utility used to be a much bigger part of the economic conversation. Utility, sort of the function. But again, if my framework here is about form and function and like the utility of things, the parts to the whole, right? The same, whatever. So I think utility is going to be important again. And, when you consider real estate from that perspective, the shift needs to be that the utility of real estate is shelter. It's housing. It's not a financial investment. Like think about how irrational it is to, like, you don't go into your house, you don't go into the place that you live every day thinking, wow, this is my investment. Like on a day-to-day, on an unconscious level, you're like, this is just where I live, where I dwell, where I do things, where I have freedom to act as I wish. And so there's a imbalance in how we actually operate with this market and the way that we're talking about it in terms of policy and economics. So it's going to go back to utility. And when you do that, I think the case in point on that is going to be, the reason why people aren't buying houses is because like you got, I think average student loan repayment, it's inching up every year in terms of time it takes to repay. For a while, or last I had seen, it was like 10 years for the average. In my personal case, it's technically that, but the interest is going to just ruin me. Like those are the terms I would say, but it's taking people way longer. And it's to the point where people are just choosing to default on their student loans because it's like such an insane hurdle that it's like not worth it. You'll never overcome this debt, right? And so people who have spent, the first, right as they enter independence, the first thing that happens when they enter the workforce and enter society is that they're slapped with this minimal of 10 years, like a 10-year sentence to repay your education. And as that time frame goes further and further out, people are less and less excited about the idea of taking on anything similar to that again. And particularly, like for me, I'm thinking about like, all right, 10 years, and I'm 10 years into the process, like I should be almost done. I'm not even close. And the idea of jumping into a 30-year mortgage, I'm going to be in debt until I retire. I'll never own that house. I'll never be out of debt. And so why would I do that? The utility for me isn't there. I can, because it doesn't provide me anything, right? Like if you think about it, just think about it logically. It might give me an opportunity to leverage it as an asset to take out loans against, but that just extends the payback period on it anyway, indirectly, to use that money for things that you could just purchase outright if you didn't have that debt anyway. It's so irrational. Like it's crazy that that's actually just the norm that we accept. And so I think much more people are thinking about like, all right, I just need a place to live, a place that I can be free and comfortable. And like the benefit over, you can't obtain full ownership. You can't pay off the house with enough time for the returns that follow the completion of that repayment, right? The increase in value following it. Because again, over time, there's additional expenses. And the longer you go with the house, by the time that 30-year mortgage is up, you have to do a whole fucking home renovation for it to have increased value in the market. And side note there too, really quickly is, oh no, come back to me. By the time you pay it off, you have to, oh, that was the other thing. So in terms of speaking about how home ownership, again, more irrational behaviors in the real estate market, as I mentioned way before, and wow, this has turned into a long one, the time it takes to repay, to pay off your mortgage, going from like 2 years in the 50s, the 40s, 50s, to 30 years, and now we're introducing into the conversation 50 years for these houses is just insane. But it's extra irrational because in many cases we're talking about the same houses that were purchased in the 40s and 50s that only took 2 years to pay off, which have only been like renovated or updated or had cosmetic lifts, right? So like it's just crazy, right? There is devaluation in real estate. Things get outdated. Plumbing needs to be fixed, right? There are costs that come the longer that you own a property. And the market has not been rational in the sense that it's reflecting those costs. It's assuming that the value of this thing just goes up over time, no matter what. It doesn't account for those updates. And I just think it should just be so obvious. It took 2 years to pay off this home in the 40s and 50s. The same home with just some cosmetic lifts and, maybe updates to plumbing or, adding AC or something. It now takes 30 years or longer to pay for that same home. So you're talking about 15 times as much longer to pay off the thing that certainly is not 15 times better than it was or 15 times more valuable than it was in the 40s or 50s, right? Like if you're thinking about it in terms of the utility that it provides the person and the costs associated, it's just so irrational. Okay. Anyway. All right. Fuck. Well, I'm glad that I captured that. Let's try to bring this home. So we're focusing on the household. We're going to start to prioritize individuals over corporations and investors and landlords. We want to empower the individual to own their own homes. Additionally, we're going to do that, right? So, and then it needs to be more specific than that. So it needs to be, here are our policy propositions for establishing precedent that we're going to prioritize the individuals over investors and whatever. There's going to be, this is where I need to do my homework. This is where I'm going in completely blind. So I'll just throw out random stuff, but this stuff needs to be ironed out. It's going to likely take the form of restructuring the perspectives, i.e. Amazon price theory versus economic structuralism. That's one way. But it's also going to be looking at corporate personhood, right? That's got to be a consideration. And so amendments to any legislation about corporate personhood to satisfy a hierarchical look at, placing the individuals in their ability to acquire land as more important. How does that? And then I want to be able to say, like, that looks like higher tax brackets, higher taxes on additional home ownership. I don't know if I love that one because I don't know if I love that one, but that's an example. So you already own a home. You're not looking to sell and buy a new one. You are now an investor in real estate. You're operating as one. And so therefore you'll be taxed higher. And so basically it's just, things that slightly de-incentivize absurd amount of investment in real estate and allow for more of that utility to rise to the top, stuff like that. So those are the ways that we're going to do it. This is our new framework. We're going to shift to economic structuralism as defined by X, Y, and Z. We're gonna amend these policies. We're gonna introduce these new bills. Let's say expansion of first-time homeowner perks, right? And critically, or sidewise, appendix here, a fundamental thread throughout all policy from the left will now be, when implementing things of this nature and assessing policy, particularly in terms of like investments and providing checks on markets and things like that, we need to provide timelines. So we'll go to that classic, like, it needs to be specific, actionable, timely, and it needs to have clear outcomes and endpoints. So we are going to enact additional first-time homeowner buying permissions. We believe at these home ownership levels that the market will stabilize and we will revisit these things. And here is our situational plan for that scenario. Well, blah, blah, blah. Right. So that speaks to this thing. I can't get to all of the topics that I said that I wanted to. So the other ones were going to be this broader economic outlook that I was going to address with more specifics, which I did, I guess, kind of get into some of those details just now, but that, the Scott Galloway, Kara Swisher experience, yada, yada, yada. So like in terms of, let's do the Scott Galloway thing and then come back to the other one if we have time. So a couple things. So Scott, what was the thing that he said that I wanted to zero in on? Oh, this was actually more, I remember now. So JB Pritzker comes to this live taping and he's there for a first chunk of the conversation. And at one point, Scott rapid fires like, all right, there's rumors that, you could have a presidential run. What are your policy stances on X, Y, and Z? And that's what I want to focus on. What I'd like to see more out of the conversation here is not, what do you think about a national service initiative? What do you think about expanding childcare stuff? Like, I don't think that that's doing justice to the situation, the circumstance that we are facing. And I don't think anybody can win. Like, they're not realizing, like, they keep saying the words, but they're not real. It's not setting in that what's going on right now is a breakdown and a need for, like, the people are calling for radical change in how everything is operating. And so we can't, that's the critical need. So we can't address that just by talking about, like, cumulatively, right? Everyone's talking about these different hot button topics, but fundamentally what the essence of everything is, like, we're unhappy with how things are operating on so many different levels. We need a new framework for everything. And the political polarization, in order, like, for this unifying thing to happen, we need to reestablish some boundaries here and best practices and etiquette. So while those are useful in certain contexts, right, the more critical conversations to be having is, like, what's your vision for the framework? What are the ideals that Democrats stand on? What are the action items, the framework action items that you can have? And so for me, that's, like, again, we are going to be the party that is about empowering individuals, reining in income inequality, like reining in fucking